Hello there, welcome to the show. Tonight we're going to talk about something light and breezy, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yes, I know, it's a topic that makes family dinners more awkward than finding out your uncle collects antique porcelain dolls of Victorian children. But stick with me, because understanding this isn't just an academic exercise. It's like trying to understand why your Wi-Fi is suddenly terrible. You have to go back to the beginning, unplug a few things, and figure out who decided to put the router in a lead-lined box in the basement. We're going to take a journey, a historical timeline if you will, through some of the most significant moments that have shaped this deeply entrenched conflict. Think of it as a highlight reel, but instead of spectacular dunks, it's a series of political decisions, wars, and uprisings that have led us to the heartbreaking headlines we see today. We'll be looking at specific dates because in this story, dates aren't just numbers on a calendar. They are fault lines, moments where the ground shifted and the future for millions of people was irrevocably altered. Now, a quick disclaimer covering this topic is like trying to defuse a bomb while riding a unicycle on a tightrope over a pool of sharks. It is incredibly complex, deeply personal, and emotionally charged for millions. We are going to walk through a series of key events which are crucial for grasping the current situation. This is not the entire story because that would require a video series longer than the entire Fast and Furious franchise, and frankly, with slightly more tragic family issues. But it is a start. So grab a stiff drink, and let's dive in. Right, so let's rewind the clock to the late 1800s. Europe is having a moment. Nationalism is all the rage, and amidst a backdrop of rising anti-Semitism and pogroms, particularly in the Russian Empire, a new political movement called Zionism emerges. Its central idea, championed by figures like Theodor Herzl, was that Jewish people, a nation without a state, needed their own country to be safe from persecution. And the ancestral homeland, the biblical land of Israel, then part of the Ottoman Empire and known as Palestine, seemed like the obvious place. It was a powerful, compelling idea, born from centuries of trauma. The problem was, and this is a rather significant one, that Palestine was not empty. It was already home to a predominantly Arab population, Muslims, Christians, and a small, pre-existing Jewish community. So, as Zionist-inspired immigration began to increase in the early 1900s, with Jewish pioneers buying land and establishing communities, it inevitably created friction. You had two burgeoning national movements with their eyes on the exact same piece of real estate. It's like two people showing up to the same Airbnb, both with confirmed reservations. Except instead of an awkward call to customer service, this situation was setting the stage for a century of conflict. Fast forward to 1917, World War I is in full swing, and the British Empire in its infinite meddling wisdom is busy making promises it can't possibly keep. They're like a terrible boyfriend on Valentine's Day who's double-booked dinner. In the midst of this, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sends a letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. This letter, the Balfour Declaration, is less than 70 words long, but carries the weight of 1,000 anvils. It states that the British government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was a massive win for the Zionist movement, giving it the legitimacy of a global superpower. But here's the kicker, the classic British and yet. The declaration also included a crucial, and ultimately, fatally ambiguous, caveat, that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So, Britain essentially promised a national home to one group in a land inhabited by another group, while vaguely promising that the second group wouldn't be inconvenienced. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic doublespeak, an attempt to have their colonial cake and eat it too. This single document laid the foundation for the future British Mandate and poured gasoline on the smoldering tensions between Arab and Jewish aspirations. By 1947, Britain had had enough. Governing Palestine had become an expensive, violent mess, so they did what any overwhelmed empire would do. They handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations, essentially saying, "You deal with it." The UN, in its first major test, formed a committee, studied the problem, and came back with a solution that was both logical and wildly optimistic. Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. The idea was to slice mandatory Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish, with Jerusalem administered as a special international zone. It was a geopolitical C-section. The reaction was, to put it mildly, split. Jewish leaders and the majority of the Jewish population, though unhappy with some of the borders, accepted the plan. It offered them the international legitimacy for a state they had been working towards for 50 years. For them, it was a historic compromise. Arab leaders and the majority of the Arab population, however, vehemently rejected it. From their perspective, the UN, a body dominated by Western powers, had no right to give away over half of their homeland to a minority population, a significant portion of whom were recent immigrants. They saw it not as a compromise, but as a profound injustice, a continuation of colonial dispossession. The vote passed, but the plan was never implemented. Instead, it became the starting gun for a civil war. As the British mandate expired, the situation on the ground had already descended into civil war. On May 14, 1948, the day before the last British soldiers sailed away, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, stood in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. For Jewish people around the world, it was a moment of monumental triumph, the realization of a 2,000-year-old dream, and, honestly, a safe haven in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. After centuries of persecution, they finally had a state of their own. The photos from that day show pure, unadulterated joy. But, that joy was not universal. The very next day, armies from 5 neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded, officially starting the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. For Palestinians, this period is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. During the war, which lasted for about a year, over 700,000 Palestinians, more than half of the Arab population, fled or were expelled from their homes in the territory that became Israel. Hundreds of their villages were destroyed. They became refugees in neighboring countries and in the parts of Palestine that Israel didn't capture, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. One people's Independence Day became another people's catastrophe. This dual, irreconcilable reality is the central trauma from which everything else flows. Let's jump to 1967. The region is a tinderbox of tension. Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, is making fiery speeches, moving troops into the Sinai Peninsula, and blockading the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's southern port. Fearing an imminent coordinated attack, Israel decides to strike first. On June 5, 1967, it launched a series of stunningly successful preemptive airstrikes that decimated the air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, while they were still on the ground. It was a military masterstroke that effectively decided the outcome of the war within hours. In the 6 days that followed, the Israeli military achieved a victory of biblical proportions. It captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The territory under Israel's control tripled in size. For many Israelis, it was a miracle, a defensive war that not only ensured their survival, but also reunited them with ancient Jewish holy sites, especially in Jerusalem's Old City. But, yeah, this victory came at a massive cost. It placed Israel in control of over 1 million Palestinians in the newly conquered territories. And what began as a preemptive strike turned into a military occupation that, more than 50 years later, has yet to end. After the shock of 1967, the Arab world was humiliated, and Israel felt, for a time, invincible. This sense of security was shattered on October 6, 1973. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack. Egyptian forces swept across the Suez Canal into the Sinai, while Syrian troops pushed into the Golan Heights. The Israeli military, caught completely off guard, suffered heavy initial losses. It was a profound psychological blow, a terrifying reminder that their military superiority was not guaranteed. Israel, with emergency military aid airlifted from the United States under President Nixon, managed to regroup and push back the invading armies. After 3 weeks of brutal fighting, a UN-brokered ceasefire was put in place. While Israel ultimately repelled the attack and even made some territorial gains, the Yom Kippur War was a trauma. It shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility and demonstrated that the status quo was unsustainable. Crucially, it also opened the door for diplomacy. The shock of the war convinced leaders on both sides, particularly Egypt's Anwar Sadat, that a military solution was impossible, paving the way for the historic Camp David Accords and the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation just a few years later. By 1987, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza had been a fact of life for 2 decades. A generation of Palestinians had grown up knowing nothing but Israeli military rule, checkpoints, and the steady encroachment of Jewish settlements on land they considered their own. The frustration and hopelessness were, honestly, just palpable. In December 1987, an Israeli army truck crashed into a car in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, killing 4 Palestinians. This incident was the spark that ignited the first Intifada, or uprising. It wasn't a war fought by armies, it was a popular grassroots rebellion. The Intifada was characterized by widespread protests, civil disobedience, general strikes, and, most iconically, Palestinian youths throwing stones at heavily armed Israeli soldiers. It was a David and Goliath image that really captured the world's attention. The Israeli response was harsh, summed up by Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin's policy of force, might, and beatings. The violence escalated over the next 6 years, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 Palestinians and more than 100 Israelis. The Intifada fundamentally changed the dynamic of the conflict. It put the plight of Palestinians under occupation on the global stage, and forced the Israeli public and its leaders to confront the moral and demographic costs of ruling over another people. The First Intifada created a sense of urgency. The status quo was clearly not working for anyone. This led to a series of secret negotiations in Norway, of all places, between Israeli and Palestinian officials. These talks, which would have been unthinkable just a few years prior, culminated in the 1993 Oslo Accords. The world watched, honestly stunned, as Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, 2 lifelong enemies, shook hands on the White House lawn, with a beaming Bill Clinton standing between them like a proud dad at a school play. The accords were based on the principle of land for peace. The PLO officially recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The agreement established the Palestinian Authority, a semi-autonomous body that would have limited self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. It was meant to be a 5-year interim plan that would lead to a final status agreement on the big issues: borders, refugees, settlements, and Jerusalem. For a moment, it felt like a genuine breakthrough, a path to a 2-state solution. It earned Rabin, Arafat, and Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres the Nobel Peace Prize. But this hope, as we now know, was tragically fragile. The optimism of Oslo quickly began to crumble. Extremists on both sides worked to sabotage the process. Hamas launched suicide bombings in Israel, and a Jewish extremist assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, a devastating blow to the peace camp. Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank also continued, undermining Palestinian trust. By 2000, the final status negotiations at Camp David, led by President Clinton, collapsed in mutual recrimination. The stage was set for another explosion. In September 2000, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon, a figure reviled by Palestinians, made a highly provocative visit to the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, a site holy to both Jews and Muslims. This visit ignited the Second Intifada. But unlike the first, this was not an uprising of stones. It was far more militarized and violent from the outset. It was characterized by deadly Palestinian suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilians on buses and in cafes, and massive Israeli military incursions into Palestinian cities, including artillery and air power. The violence was, frankly, horrifying on both sides. leading to the deaths of roughly 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis over 5 years. The Second Intifada effectively destroyed the last remnants of the Oslo peace process, shattered any remaining trust between the two societies, and ushered in an era of deep cynicism and despair. In the wake of the Second Intifada, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, the very man whose visit helped ignite it, did something completely unexpected. In 2005, he initiated a so-called disengagement plan. This involved the unilateral withdrawal of all Israeli soldiers and the forcible evacuation of around 9,000 Israeli settlers from 21 settlements in the Gaza Strip, as well as 4 from the northern West Bank. From the Israeli perspective, it was a painful but necessary move to improve Israel's security and reduce the friction of occupying a densely populated and hostile territory. It was honestly a dramatic move, with scenes of Israeli soldiers dragging crying settlers from their homes. For Palestinians, however, the disengagement was viewed with deep suspicion. It was a unilateral move, done without negotiation or agreement. While they welcomed the removal of settlements from their land, they pointed out that Israel retained control of Gaza's borders, its coastline, and its airspace. Israel was no longer in Gaza, but it was still very much in control of Gaza, able to turn the taps of commerce and movement on and off at will. Many saw it not as a step towards peace, but as a strategic redeployment, allowing Israel to shed responsibility for 1.5 million Palestinians, while cementing its control over the West Bank, where settlement construction continued to expand. It was less a divorce, and more a move into a separate bedroom with a very, very secure lock on the door. The power vacuum left by Israel's withdrawal from Gaza set the stage for a Palestinian civil war. In the 2006 legislative elections, the militant Islamist group Hamas, which had long opposed the Oslo Accords and called for Israel's destruction, won a surprise victory over the long-dominant Fatah party. This led to an international boycott of the Palestinian Authority, as the United States and the European Union refused to deal with a government led by what they designated a terrorist organization. Tensions between Hamas and Fatah, which had been simmering for years, finally boiled over. In June 2007, after a brief but bloody conflict, Hamas fighters seized complete control of the Gaza Strip, violently ousting Fatah forces. This created a profound political split. The Palestinian leadership was now divided. Hamas ruled Gaza, and the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority governed parts of the West Bank. In response to the Hamas takeover, Israel and Egypt imposed a strict land, air, and sea blockade on the Gaza Strip, severely restricting the movement of people and goods. Israel argued the blockade was necessary to prevent Hamas from importing weapons. But the United Nations and human rights groups have called it a form of collective punishment, crippling Gaza's economy and creating a humanitarian crisis for its 2 million residents. But on October 7, 2023, the simmering pot exploded with a ferocity no one saw coming. Under the cover of thousands of rockets, Hamas militants breached the sophisticated border fence and launched a brutal, coordinated attack on southern Israel. They stormed military bases, kibbutzim, and a music festival, killing around 1,200 people, the vast majority of them civilians, and taking approximately 240 hostages back to Gaza. The sheer barbarity of the attacks, with widespread reports of torture and sexual violence, constituted the deadliest day in Israel's history, and a trauma that has shaken the nation to its core. Israel's response was swift, massive, and devastating. It declared war on Hamas, vowing to destroy the group and rescue the hostages. It launched an unprecedented air and ground campaign in the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated places on Earth. The scale of the bombing, the displacement of over 1 million people, and the spiraling Palestinian death toll, which quickly surpassed all previous conflicts, created a humanitarian catastrophe of staggering proportions. The events of October 7th and its aftermath have plunged the region into one of its darkest chapters, shattering any remaining illusions and leaving the future more uncertain and terrifying than ever before. And there you have it, A whirlwind tour through more than a century of promises, partitions, wars, uprisings, and failed handshakes. As you can see, this isn't a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's a tragedy of two peoples with deep, legitimate connections to the same small piece of land, locked in a cycle of violence and trauma, where each side's national narrative is built on the other's suffering. Every key date we've discussed is a wound that has never properly healed, and instead has been salted and reopened by the next turn of the screw. Today, the conflict remains profoundly unresolved. The core issues that were on the table at Camp David in 2000 are still the same. The final borders of a potential Palestinian state, the ever-expanding Israeli settlements, the status of Jerusalem, which both sides claim as their capital, and the fate of millions of Palestinian refugees and their descendants. The path to a two-state solution, long the stated goal of the international community, now seems more remote than ever, with many on both sides having lost all faith in its possibility. What the future holds is impossible to say. But one thing is certain: a lasting peace cannot be built on a foundation of occupation, violence, and despair. Understanding this history isn't about picking a side. It's about understanding the depth of the grievances, the weight of the past, and the immense, almost impossible challenge of finding a way for two peoples to share a future without destroying each other. It's a bleak picture, and if you're not feeling a little depressed right now, you probably haven't been paying attention. Good night.